At my husband's promotion gala, he stood under the bright ballroom lights, smiling like he had conquered the world. The room was filled with executives, partners, and their spouses. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Everyone was waiting for his speech. I was standing near the front, wearing the navy dress he once said was his favorite. Then he raised his glass. He talked about hard work. He talked about sacrifice. He talked about the hardest stretch this year. I felt proud for a second. I thought he would look at me. Instead, he looked across the room. "There's someone who stood by me during the toughest months," he said warmly. "Delaney, I couldn't have done it without you." The room shifted. Some people turned their heads. Some looked at me. Delaney stood slowly, acting surprised, but she was glowing. She looked young, confident, perfectly styled. My husband smiled at her in a way I hadn't seen in years. He didn't say my name. 14 years of marriage, and I disappeared in one sentence. I felt something strange inside me. It wasn't tears. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Marin Whitlock. His name is Graham Whitlock. We built a life in Chicago together. Or at least, I thought we did. As people clapped for Delaney, I remembered the long nights years ago when Graham studied for his MBA while I worked double shifts at the hospital. I remembered selling my share of my grandmother's lake cabin so he could invest in his first business idea. I remembered moving cities twice so he could chase better opportunities. He used to tell me, "When I make it, it will be our success." But somewhere along the way, our became his. In the last year, he had changed. He came home late. His phone was always face down. He said he had strategy meetings that ran until midnight. I didn't argue. I watched. I listened. I paid attention. When I first heard Delaney's name months ago, he described her as sharp and essential to the team. He praised her mind. He praised her drive. He never praised me anymore. Standing in that ballroom, hearing him thank her publicly, something settled inside me. The doubts I had been pushing away suddenly felt real. This wasn't just admiration. It wasn't just mentorship. It was betrayal. But I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I didn't confront him in front of everyone. I clapped. Because in that moment, I understood something he didn't. He thought I was blindsided. He thought I was weak. He had no idea I had already started looking closer at everything. And that night, as the applause faded and people congratulated him, I made a quiet promise to myself. If he wanted to rewrite our story in public, I would make sure the truth was written in permanent ink. At the gala, after the applause faded and people returned to their tables, I stayed calm. I even congratulated Graham with a soft smile. He kissed my cheek like nothing unusual had happened. Delaney stood a few feet away, holding a glass of champagne, pretending not to watch us. But she was watching. On the drive home, the silence between us was heavy. "You were quiet tonight," he said casually, keeping his eyes on the road. "It was your night," I replied. He nodded, satisfied with that answer. He didn't notice that something inside me had shifted completely. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't doubting my instincts. I knew. Over the next few days, I didn't argue or accuse him. I paid attention. He was texting more than ever, smiling at his phone, leaving early, coming home late. When I asked simple questions, his answers were short and irritated. "You're overthinking," he told me one evening. Maybe I was. Or maybe I had ignored the signs for too long. I remembered the dinner receipt I had once found in his blazer pocket months ago. A reservation for 2 at a high-end steakhouse on a night he told me he was stuck in meetings. At the time, I convinced myself it was a client dinner. Now it felt different. Instead of confronting him, I started gathering information quietly. I checked our joint financial statements more carefully. I noticed charges that didn't make sense. Luxury hotel bookings labeled as business travel. Weekend flights when there were no conferences scheduled. My heart hurt, but my mind stayed steady. Graham thought I was just a nurse who trusted him blindly. He forgot that before nursing, I had studied business law. I understood contracts. I understood ownership structures. And I knew something important he had clearly forgotten. Years ago, when he started his first consulting company, I helped him file the paperwork. My name was listed as a minority co-owner. When his company later merged into the larger corporation where he now worked, that early ownership translated into a small but real stake. I had never used it. I never needed to. Until now. I contacted an old colleague, Sloan Mercer, an attorney I trusted. I didn't tell her I wanted revenge. I told her I wanted clarity. I asked what rights I still had as a stakeholder. I asked what access I could legally request. She was surprised to learn my name was still on foundational documents. Marin, she said carefully, this gives you more power than you think. Power wasn't what I wanted. I wanted the truth. With Sloane's guidance, I requested financial transparency documents under my rights as a minority stakeholder. I kept it professional, calm, legal. A week later, Graham came home tense. Why is the finance department saying someone requested audit access? He asked sharply. I looked at him steadily. I did. He laughed at first. You wouldn't even understand half of those reports. I walked to the drawer in my desk and pulled out copies of the original incorporation papers from years ago. I placed them on the kitchen table and tapped the signature line. My name is right there, Graham. His smile disappeared. For the first time in years, he looked unsure. He had built his success on the belief that I would always stand quietly behind him. He never imagined I would stand across from him. And that was the moment he realized this wasn't about jealousy. It was about consequences. The tension in the house changed after that night. Graham stopped laughing about the audit request. He stopped making sarcastic comments. Instead, he became defensive. You're embarrassing me, he said one evening. This is going to raise questions. I'm just reviewing what I have the right to review, I answered calmly. What he didn't know was that the documents were already being examined carefully. Sloane had connected me with a financial analyst who understood corporate reporting better than I ever could. I didn't need to know every number. I just needed to know if something was wrong. And something was wrong. There were repeated travel expenses marked as client acquisition. But there were no new clients attached to those trips. Hotel bookings listed as business meetings, yet scheduled over weekends. Restaurant charges far beyond normal client dinners. One entry stood out the most, a luxury suite booked for 3 nights during a regional strategy retreat. Only 2 guests were listed on the reservation. When I saw the dates, my stomach tightened. That was the same weekend Graham told me he was too busy to attend my father's small birthday dinner. The pattern became clear. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was repeated behavior. Sloane explained it plainly. If company funds were used for personal relationships, especially involving someone he supervises, that's a serious violation. Not just morally, legally. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was misconduct. Meanwhile, at home, Graham grew restless. He started asking strange questions. Are you trying to ruin me? He asked late one night. I'm trying to understand what's happening, I replied. You're overreacting. No, I said quietly. I'm responding. A few days later, I received confirmation that the company's internal ethics board had scheduled a formal review based on the financial irregularities flagged during the audit request. My name wasn't mentioned as the source. It was framed as a routine stakeholder concern. When Graham got the notification of an internal review, the color drained from his face. This is serious, he muttered. I didn't answer. At work, things escalated quickly. The board began questioning expense approvals and management decisions. Delaney's rapid promotions were examined. Her salary increases were compared against performance records. Everything that had once seemed small now formed a clear picture. One evening, Graham came home earlier than usual. He looked tired, not physically but emotionally shaken. They're asking about Delaney, he said carefully. I held his gaze. And what are you telling them? That she's talented. That she earned her position. But did she? I asked softly. He didn't respond. Days later, the official notice arrived. Delaney was terminated for violating company policy. Graham was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The promotion he had celebrated so proudly was suspended. For the first time in years, he sat at our kitchen table without answers. No confidence. No charm. No control. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. What have you done? He asked quietly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I told the truth, I said. And the truth was finally louder than his speech at that gala. The house felt different after he was placed on leave. It was quieter but not peaceful. Graham walked around like a man who had lost his balance. He kept making phone calls behind closed doors. His lawyers, senior partners, anyone who could help him control the damage. But this time, he wasn't in control. The company's investigation moved fast. They reviewed years of expense reports, internal emails, travel approvals, and performance evaluations. The more they looked, the worse it became. Delaney's rapid promotions had been signed off directly by him. Bonuses approved without proper review. Trips labeled as business that clearly were not. The board wasn't angry about the affair itself. They were angry about liability. One evening, Graham sat across from me at the kitchen table. His hands were shaking slightly. "They're renegotiating my contract," he said. "They're stripping my authority." I listened quietly. "This is humiliating," he added. I thought about the gala, about the way he had smiled at Delaney in front of everyone, about how invisible I had felt standing there. Humiliation cuts deep when it finally turns around. A few weeks later, the final decision came. His promotion was officially rescinded. He would remain with the company under a reduced role, limited authority, and strict oversight. The title he had celebrated so proudly was gone. Delaney was completely removed from the company. At home, the tension exploded. "You could have talked to me," he shouted one night. "You didn't have to destroy everything." "I didn't destroy it," I replied steadily. "You did." He paced the living room like a trapped animal. "You wanted revenge." "No," I said calmly. "I wanted honesty." The truth was, I had already made another decision. While the investigation was happening, Sloan had quietly prepared something else. Financial records, asset breakdowns, documentation of how his misconduct affected shared investments and marital finances. I had spent years supporting his career, sacrificing promotions of my own, relocating when needed, adjusting my life to fit his ambitions. Now it was time to protect myself. When I handed him the divorce papers, he stared at them in disbelief. "You're leaving?" he asked, as if the idea had never crossed his mind. "Yes." "After everything?" I looked at him carefully. "Exactly." He assumed I would stay because I always had. He believed loyalty meant permanence, no matter what he did. But loyalty without respect is just endurance. The divorce process was calm but firm. Because of the corporate violations and financial misrepresentation, the settlement favored me more than he expected. Not because I demanded punishment, but because the numbers spoke clearly. I didn't take everything. I took what I had helped build. I bought back my grandmother's lake cabin share, the one I had sold years ago to support his first business dream. That small piece of land meant more to me than any title he ever held. 6 months later, I saw him outside a cafe downtown. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, just diminished. He asked quietly, "Why didn't you just confront me?" I answered honestly, "Because if I had screamed, you would have called me emotional. If I had cried, you would have called me dramatic. So I chose evidence." He lost his promotion, his reputation, his affair. But what truly broke him wasn't the investigation. It was realizing the woman he underestimated was the one who built the foundation beneath him. And when he chose someone else in that ballroom, he unknowingly gave me the strength to walk away, not broken, but free. After the divorce was finalized, the silence in my life felt different from the silence in our marriage. This one wasn't heavy. It wasn't tense. It was open. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to come home late. I didn't feel like I was adjusting my schedule around someone else's priorities. The house felt like it belonged to me again. The first weekend after everything was official, I drove out to the lake cabin. Buying it back had felt symbolic at first. But when I stepped onto that wooden porch again, I realized it was more than that. It was the last piece of myself I had given away years ago to help build his dreams. Standing there, watching the water move quietly under the sunset, I finally felt something close to peace. I thought I would feel anger. Instead, I felt clarity. For weeks after the divorce, Graham tried to contact me. Not to apologize properly. Not to take responsibility. Mostly to understand. "I never thought you'd actually leave," he admitted during one brief phone call. That sentence said everything. He didn't think I would leave because he believed I would always tolerate whatever he did. He thought my loyalty was permanent, no matter how little respect he gave me. What he never understood was that I wasn't weak. I was patient, and patience has limits. At work, I shifted my schedule and finally accepted a supervisory role I had once turned down because it would have required more hours. For years, I had minimized my own growth to make space for his. Now there was no reason to hold myself back. It wasn't easy. Some nights I cried. Not because I missed him, but because I mourned the version of him I thought I married. The young man who once promised that our success would always be shared. But grief doesn't last forever when truth sets in. One afternoon, about 8 months later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Graham had quietly transferred to a smaller branch office in another state. His influence was limited. His reputation never fully recovered. Delaney had moved on too, but not upward. The corporate world can be unforgiving when ethics are involved. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt distance. The real revenge wasn't watching him fall. It was realizing I no longer cared. One evening at the lake, sitting by the water with a cup of coffee, I asked myself a simple question. If that gala night had never happened, would I still be living half a life? The answer was yes. As painful as that moment was, it forced me to see the truth I had been ignoring. I had been shrinking for years, making myself smaller, so his shadow looked bigger. Now there was no shadow over me. I started reconnecting with old friends. I visited my parents more often. I began planning small trips without asking anyone's permission or checking anyone else's calendar. Freedom doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels quiet and steady. And if there's one thing I learned, it's this: betrayal doesn't destroy you when you respond with clarity instead of chaos. It reveals who you really are. And the woman he thanked publicly in that ballroom may have thought she had won something that night. But the real victory was mine. Because I walked away with my dignity, my independence, and the life I deserved. About a year after everything ended, I stopped telling the story as something that had happened to me. It became something that had changed me. In the beginning, people looked at me with sympathy. Some whispered. Some said they were so sorry. A few even hinted that maybe I should have fought harder for my marriage. They didn't understand. I didn't lose my marriage the night of the gala. I lost it slowly, over years of being unseen. What the gala did was expose it. I started therapy a few months after the divorce. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand why I had stayed quiet for so long. Why I had accepted less than I deserved. My therapist asked me a question that stayed with me. When did you start believing that love meant sacrifice without limit? I didn't have an answer right away. But over time, I realized something important. I had confused support with self-erasure. I thought being a good wife meant always adjusting, always forgiving, always understanding. I didn't realize that partnership should go both ways. One evening, while cleaning out old storage boxes, I found a stack of letters Graham had written to me when we were younger. They were full of dreams, full of gratitude. He used to thank me for believing in him. Somewhere along the road to success, gratitude turned into entitlement. And I allowed it, not because I was weak, but because I loved him. That's the complicated part about betrayal. It doesn't erase the good memories. It forces you to look at them differently. Months passed and life felt steady. I expanded my role at the hospital. I mentored younger nurses. I started taking weekend courses just for myself, nothing career-related, just things I enjoyed. One afternoon at the lake cabin, I sat on the dock with my feet in the water and realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. The humiliation at the gala, the investigation, the divorce, they no longer replayed in my mind the way they used to. They felt like chapters that had already been read. I understood something clearly then. The worst part of betrayal isn't the other person choosing someone else. It's realizing you chose yourself last. And once I stopped doing that, everything changed. I didn't become colder. I didn't become bitter. If anything, I became stronger in a quieter way. I started speaking up more at work, setting boundaries with family, saying no without explaining myself. Freedom isn't dramatic. It's subtle. Sometimes it looks like sitting alone on a dock, breathing deeply, knowing no one is secretly rewriting your story behind your back. I don't know if Graham ever fully understood what he lost. Maybe he thinks it was just a marriage. Maybe he thinks it was pride. But what he really lost was the one person who believed in him before anyone else did. And what I gained was something far more valuable than a title, a gala, or public recognition. I gained myself. 2 years after the gala, I attended another formal event. This time, it was for the hospital, a fundraising dinner for a new patient care wing. I wasn't there as someone's wife. I wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. I was there as a department supervisor who had helped lead a major initiative. When they called my name to thank the team, I walked to the stage alone. The applause felt different. Not louder, not grander, just honest. As I looked out at the room, I remembered that night when Graham had raised his glass and thanked someone else. I remembered the heat in my face, the way my heart had pounded, the quiet decision I made in that moment not to crumble. Back then, I thought that night had destroyed something. Now I understood it had revealed something. After the event, I stepped outside for air. The city lights reflected off the buildings just like they had the night of his gala. For a second, I felt the strange symmetry of it all. Same kind of ballroom. Same kind of speeches. Very different woman. A colleague approached me and said, "You seem really steady. Like nothing shakes you." I smiled softly. If only she knew. I had been shaken. I had been hurt. I had questioned my worth. But I had also chosen not to let betrayal define me. That was the difference. Healing didn't happen in one big moment. It happened in small choices. Choosing not to check if he had called. Choosing not to replay his speech in my mind. Choosing not to measure my value by someone else's attention. One afternoon later that year, I ran into Graham again by coincidence at a grocery store. It wasn't dramatic. No intense music playing in the background. Just two people in the same aisle. He looked surprised. "Marin," he said quietly. "Graham." There was an awkward pause. He looked like he wanted to say something important. Maybe an apology. Maybe regret. Instead, he asked, "Are you happy?" It was such a simple question. "Yes," I answered honestly. And I was. Not because everything was perfect. Not because betrayal hadn't hurt. But because I had rebuilt my life on something solid, self-respect. He nodded slowly, like he was trying to understand that answer. As I walked away, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. Sometimes people think revenge has to be loud. Explosive. Public. Mine wasn't. Mine was quiet strength. Legal truth. Walking away without begging to be chosen. He thanked someone else that night in front of a ballroom full of people. And in doing so, he unknowingly freed me. The real destruction wasn't his career setback or the divorce papers. It was the illusion he had about who I was. He thought I would stay silent forever. He was wrong. And in the end, I didn't just survive the betrayal. I stepped out of it stronger, clearer, and finally standing fully in my own light.